Good afternoon again. My name is Kim. We're going to get started with our July advocacy webinar. We're really thrilled that many of you have decided to join us today, and hopefully wherever you are, you're remaining safe and hopefully cool and not in harm's way. We know this is a very busy time of year with vacations and other maybe travel that people are doing. We're gonna learn a lot more about what we're doing on the travel front. But I just wanted to let everyone know that this webinar will be recorded. We'll be sending it out to anyone who registered and be posting this on the Reeve Foundation's YouTube channel. So hopefully, if you're unable to join us, you'll be able to watch this at a later time. So let's get started. Today's agenda, we'll be doing, of course, introductions and our welcome. We have some great news regarding the Paralysis Resource Center. We'll spend some time talking about congressional updates. We have a special guest who will address the ACAA. You'll learn more about that. And of course, Chris will, with many of you communicate with on a daily basis, will be providing a grassroots update and activities that we hope you'll take part in and during the August recess. Again, I'm Kim Beer, the Director of Public Policy. We have our wonderful colleagues from Waxman Strategies, Celicia Lomax and John Sawyer, who will be addressing us, as well as Chris Carson, the Policy and Advocacy Coordinator. And of course, you speak with him all the time. Our special guest is Heather Ansley. We're thrilled she can join us. We're so grateful for her time. She's the Associate Executive Director of Government Relations at Paralyzed Veterans of America. And I know many of you often ask us with whom we work with here in Washington. And PVA is a wonderful collaborative partner. And we're so thrilled that Heather and PVA are really leading efforts around improving air travel for people with disabilities. And we're very privileged to be part of their coalition. Before we get started, I just want to update everyone. The Reeve Foundation, as you know, has operated the Paralysis Resource Center proudly since 2002, and we have competed in a cooperative grant application process every 3 years. And we have recently just resubmitted our application, and this cooperative grant will be for 5 years. And we were notified earlier this month that we've been awarded a 5-year cooperative grant to fund and continue our activities under the Paralysis Resource Center. And as many of you know, you work very hard to help us ensure that Congress knows our work and that we're able to continue funding. And of course, we've enjoyed several increases to really improve the lives of those living with spinal cord injury and paralysis. We can't do this without you. And so this is really a celebration for all of us. And thank you to all of you who've supported the foundation, the Paralysis Resource Center, with your time, your energy, and your advocacy. I'm going to pass it over to my colleague, Celicia. She'll be providing some congressional updates. Celicia?
Awesome. Thanks so much, Kim. And I just want to take a moment to, again, echo what you just mentioned. This is a really big moment for the Paralysis Resource Center to receive that grant, and really want to give kudos to everyone on this call. Thank you for joining us, and also thank you for all of your support and effort and advocacy and getting to this point. It's really been a group effort, and it's really great to see that. So I'll give a little bit of an overview over our appropriations timeline that we have. Right now, the appropriations committees have begun releasing and the markup of bills, and this will continue throughout the rest of this month. For example, Labor HHS, their subcommittee in the House met on July 12th for their markup, and then the full committee met on July 15th. So we know that this is a moving process. There's a lot of moving parts, a lot of action happening around appropriations, especially within the House, but the Senate outlook is a little bit unclear. Part of this is because there isn't full consensus on where funding should go to different entities. So we are continuing to keep a close eye on that appropriations process, as it is a lengthy one and it can be a bit challenging to make sure you keep up with all of the different entities. One thing that's particularly important with this timeline is that the end of the federal fiscal year is October 1st. Typically, this isn't always met on October 1st. And so this could mean that we'll see a continuing resolution, which is essentially extending that funding through December. And again, it'll be a question of whether or not the process will be able to finish in time because it is lengthy, because it has to go through so many different moving parts, it can be a challenge. So we're definitely going to continue to keep our eyes peeled as we follow that process. And so I'll move on to the appropriations for the Paralysis Resource Center and that funding. And so as Kim mentioned, it did receive, approved funding for the Paralysis Resource Center at about $10.2 million, which is a really great number considering that's a 5% increase to last year's number. That's also the same increase that was asked for by President Biden in his budget request for fiscal year 2022. So we are seeing alignment there in the approval of those funds. And so what we're waiting for really is for this to get passed by the Senate and into law. And that would mean that there would be a $300,000 increase for the National Paralysis Resource Center to $9 million to continue all of its efforts in supporting the community, living with paralysis and caregivers. And so this will be really important for us to continue to follow. And so we ask everyone here as well to make sure you keep an eye out for any action alerts as we continue moving through this process. It is a lengthy one, but we'll see it move forward. And so I'll pass it over to John to give some additional congressional updates.
Great. Thank you so much, Celicia. And thank you, Kim and Chris and Heather and others on the call today. There is a lot going on in Washington right now, and I think it's easiest to think of it as sort of three parallel tracks that are happening. One is that appropriations process that Celicia just walked us through. That's that annual process that really determines funding levels for really thousands of government programs on an annual basis. Separate from that, but moving in parallel, is this process around infrastructure. And one thing you will notice if you've been following the news on this is that unlike maybe in past Congresses, infrastructure this year is being interpreted and defined pretty widely. And then we've talked in past webinars about President Biden's proposals around infrastructure. First, his American Jobs Plan, which really focused on what people are referring to more as hard infrastructure, roads, bridges, airports, broadband. But that jobs plan also included a proposal that we'll talk about in a moment for funding for home and community-based services, which would have such a huge impact on our community and on the caregiver workforce. And then separately from that, the American Families Plan, which really focused on what they would term the human infrastructure. So really the various programs that really support individuals and families. And so what's happening in Congress is that those two plans have kind of morphed into two different moving trains in Congress. And again, this is separate from the appropriations process. One of those, which is much more focused on the hard infrastructure questions, is moving on a bipartisan basis. Some in DC have called this, it's called the Bipartisan Infrastructure Framework. And people have even given it the shorthand nickname of the BIF. Whether you support that or not, that's one of the pieces of the puzzle here that's moving. So there's a group of bipartisan senators, 10 bipartisan senators who've been working very hard to negotiate this legislation. The biggest challenge I think that they're up against is figuring out, number one, how to pay for the proposal, which the spending is pretty agreed upon. It's, again, roads, bridges, transit, and other, infrastructure elements, but the how to pay for those elements is still kind of up in the air. And then process-wise, the other real challenge that they're up against is the clock and the timeline and the Senate calendar. Again, Congress, as always, is planning to leave town for August. And so there's a real push to get as much done as possible before August. So they are getting closer to converting this agreement, which was sort of agreed to in principle, into legislative text. Of course, that's where the devil lies in the details. There are challenges that lie ahead in terms of making sure that that gets the support it needs. As a reminder, that's 60 votes in the Senate for any process that moves outside of what we call budget reconciliation. We'll talk about that in just a second. But this is sort of the second moving vehicle, and I think we'll know within a matter of days whether this has the support, the details, and the number of votes in order to move ahead. And then the next area that we're focused on, and Chris, if you want to move it to the next slide. So actually, let's go to the next slide, and then we'll come back to this one if that's okay. So that's my fault. So the third sort of moving train here is what's called budget reconciliation, and that is the process in the Senate which allows for votes to be certain legislation to be passed with only 50 votes in the Senate plus the vice president to break a tie. And so what is currently being put together is sort of the blueprint for a very large piece of legislation that would go through the budget reconciliation process later this year. And what that includes is really everything from President Biden's two big proposals that isn't included in the bipartisan infrastructure plan. So it's on the order as of now of about $3.5 trillion. There's a wide range of proposals still to be included in that. The paid family and medical leave, universal pre-K, the expanded child tax credits, which we'll go back to in just a moment, expansions of Medicare to cover hearing, dental, and vision care, expansions of Medicaid in states that have not expanded Medicaid yet, or expansion of a Medicaid-like program, extension of some of the subsidies that went into the Affordable Care Act in the American Rescue Plan earlier this year, and then also that home and community-based services funding, which we'll talk about in just a moment. So in other words, there's sort of three tracks that Congress is working on right now: appropriations, the bipartisan infrastructure bill, and this larger budget reconciliation process, which kicks off the next step in that is a passage of a budget resolution, which is essentially the blueprint that unlocks that process. So those are the things we're watching, and there's any number of different really, really important policy initiatives included in those. So Chris, if you want to go back, so one of the things that passed in the bill that was signed into law earlier this year, the American Rescue Plan Act, was a growth in and a change to the structure of the child tax credit. And so folks may be aware, there's been a lot of coverage of this in the news. This may have even impacted you and your families, that starting this past July 15th, monthly payments from expanded child tax credits are being sent to eligible families. Some of the details are here on the screen. I don't have to walk through that formula exactly, but the big change here is that this is now a more generous child tax credit than before. It's also being distributed in monthly payments as opposed to just at the end of the year when you file your taxes. So it's expected to make a really big impact on child poverty in this country, but something to pay attention to because many folks are potentially eligible. One thing to note is that this expanded child tax credit was passed for just 1 year. It's a pretty expensive proposal in terms of federal budgets, but there is already a lot of momentum to try and include an extension of that increased child tax credit in a budget deal later this year. So moving on, just to highlight, this is something we've talked about a lot on past webinars, home and community-based services funding through Medicaid. A big cornerstone piece of President Biden's infrastructure proposal was growth in expansion of funding for Medicaid home and community-based services. This would expand access to these services through state-level Medicaid programs, really designed to support the elderly and people living with disabilities in their homes. And there's a broad base of support for HCBS funding. It would also have the effect of really expanding and strengthening those who work in the caregiving workforce, obviously really vital to our community. This funding and this proposal is connected to that larger third path that we were talking about earlier, the budget reconciliation process. So one thing we'll be monitoring as we go through this process is Is that staying in the package? Is it staying at the $400 billion level that President Biden proposed? Is it being shortened? Is it being cut? So we'll be paying close attention to that along with the Reeve team as this goes forward, working in partnership and coalition. So that's a quick overview of where things are in Washington. It's a busy couple of weeks here, as it always is in the couple of weeks before Congress wants to get out of town. But it'll be an even busier couple of weeks when they get back in September and really have some hard deadlines that they have to meet. And so before Heather starts, I'll turn it back over to Kim just to introduce this part of the presentation.
Great. Thank you so much, John and Celicia. I also failed to mention just a little bit of housekeeping that should anyone have any questions, feel free to post it in the chat. We'll take questions. We'll try to monitor them throughout the presentation, but also have time at the end. Just wanted to mention that before I introduced Heather. And Heather Ansley is the Associate General Counsel for Corporate and Government Relations at Paralyzed Veterans of America. Her responsibilities include managing the organization's efforts on Capitol Hill and working with the administration to promote legislation and policies that ensure veterans with catastrophic disabilities receive the healthcare and benefits that they have earned and the civil rights protections that they deserve. Additionally, she serves as an officer for the CCD's Board of Directors. And prior to joining PVA, Ms. Ansley served as Vice President of Vets First, a program of United Spinal Association, and as the Director of Policy and Advocacy for the Lutheran Services and American Disability Network. She holds a BA from the University of Missouri-Columbia, an MSW from the University of Missouri-Columbia, and a JD from the Washburn University School of Law in Kansas. We're thrilled to have Heather, and thank you so much, Heather.
Well, thank you, Kim, for that warm introduction, and I'm very pleased to be with you all today to talk a little bit about the Air Carrier Access Amendments Act, but then also in general efforts to improve access to air travel for people with disabilities. We could go to the next slide, please. So I always think it's helpful to give a brief overview of the Air Carrier Access Act because it's the only form of really mass transportation not covered by the Americans with Disabilities Act. So as passengers with disabilities have certain rights in air travel that are guaranteed by the Air Carrier Access Act. And this law was signed into effect in October of 1986. So we are getting ready to celebrate the 35th anniversary later this fall. So this law was passed in order to ensure that people with disabilities would receive consistent and non-discriminatory treatment when traveling by air. And it covers domestic or US airlines on all flights and then foreign carriers when they are traveling to and from the US. Prior to passage of the Air Carrier Access Act, a person with a disability could have a ticket and show up and be ready to travel and be told that the airline deemed them too disabled to travel, and that was the end of the journey. There was really no protection, civil rights protections for those individuals. And PVA filed a lawsuit under the only law that existed at that time that could be possibly applicable, which was the Rehabilitation Act of 1973 in Section 504, which governs if federal funding is going into something, then then civil rights protections attach. And the Supreme Court decided that unless airlines themselves got funding, that all of the funding that goes into the airports and the FAA, governing the airspace, that wasn't sufficient. So we went to Congress and in the span of 3 months got the Air Carrier Access Act, which we could never do today. And it was also bipartisan. So some of the protections that are there because of the law are airlines must give passengers with disabilities additional time to board if that's something they request, provide guide assistance in getting to the gate. This can include stopping by a restroom if the person requests. Assistance must also be given to ensure that people are able to make connecting flights and also that assistance that is provided can be done by someone who works directly for the airline, or in many cases, it's someone who works for a service provider that contracts with the airline. Airlines actually contract out a lot of the services that you see at the airport, even sometimes gate agents, ticket agents, that sort of thing, to other companies. So in addition, air carriers must provide prompt assistance at the request of the person who needs it with boarding and deplaning. And that can include the use of a wheelchair, including the aisle chair, the dreaded aisle chair, on board wheelchairs, accessible motorized carts you might see in the airport. And then if we're looking particularly at smaller aircrafts, the use of ramps or mechanical lifts, if there are stairs that other passengers would traverse to get up into the plane. Air carriers are also required to allow passengers with disabilities to stow manual wheelchairs, canes, crutches, walkers, other similar devices on the aircraft. There are no baggage limits for assistive devices. And if the cabin has a closet, then a wheelchair or other device must have access over the crew's stored items or other passengers' items that may be in that closet. And there's also something called seat strapping that the Department of Transportation put into place, where you can ask to have your manual wheelchair seat strapped to the passenger seat using a strapping kit in the cabin, even if that displaces a passenger. They can have up to 2 in the cabin if the second chair does not displace a passenger. I will note that although that is in the rule, that the Department of Transportation has given some airlines what they call an equivalent determination, which means the airline says, oh, we've got another way we can transport wheelchairs, so you should give us an exception from the seat strapping. So it always pays to talk to your airline ahead of travel and figure out what the requirements are if that's something you wish to try to do. If assistive devices are damaged, the normal baggage limits do not apply. So typically if the airlines damage something that you're checking that they consider to be baggage, there's a limit to how much they're going to pay you for that item. That's not the case with the wheelchair. So if they break your $30,000 power chair, there is no limit in the amount that they're going to have to pay to fix that. The Air Carrier Access Act also requires airlines to provide passengers with a seat that meets their disability-related needs, but the catch is that it's within your class of service. So that means if you purchase the coach ticket, which many of us, that's how we travel, then they don't have to provide you with a first-class seat as an accommodation. They might, sometimes they do, but it's not required. However, if you purchase that Economy Plus ticket, you're looking for a little more room, and you really need an aisle seat, then they have to accommodate you with an aisle seat in the Economy Plus section. And if there is an additional fee, sometimes you'll see when you go to book a ticket, if you want to be on the aisle or the window, it's like, oh, you got to pay us an additional $15 or something like that. They can't charge you for those extra upgrade fees within your class of service. Now, that's not really evident from booking on the airline's website, but that is in fact the law. I also wanted to note that because there have been some significant changes here, that the Air Carrier Access Act does provide access for service animals. Earlier this year, the department changed its rules and said that service animal access is allowed, but it's only a dog. Before, you could have other types of animals. So now it's limited to a dog, and it has to be a service animal that's been individually trained to provide assistance. So they're no longer required to transport emotional support animals as well. So there's also the department gave airlines the ability to request these documentation forms that have to be completed in advance. So if you are somebody who uses a service animal and you're going to be traveling by air, the rules have probably changed since the last time you were flying, if you haven't flown since before the pandemic. So do make sure that you check the rules before you head out to the airport on the day of travel, because you will need to do some additional steps that before you didn't have to do. Unfortunately, despite these civil rights protections, many passengers with disabilities regularly encounter difficulties in air travel. And some of these difficulties are including navigating through the TSA checkpoints and being subject to invasive pat downs and airline service contractors that are really not properly trained, boarding devices that are in disrepair, inaccessible lavatories, and of course the list goes on and on and on. Next slide, please. So some of those barriers that I mentioned, these are the ones that we hear from our members, and based on the population that the Reeve Foundation serves, I'm guessing they're fairly similar. One is that untrained or delayed assistance in boarding or deplaning. For example, before the pandemic in October of 2019, we had a PBA member who was hand carried off of an airplane. There wasn't an emergency requiring it. It was, just a standard arrival. But she was informed that allowing individuals to carry her off the plane was the only way for her to deplane. She was on a smaller aircraft in a smaller airport, and they hadn't made provisions to get her off any other way. She reluctantly agreed, even though she was very uncomfortable with the process. She was afraid she might be dropped. And she was also afraid that the people who were trying to help her could be hurt. And in fact, she said as she was being carried through the plane, she could feel those who were trying to help her struggle, in the process. And it was just very discomforting for her. And it's a clear violation of the Air Carrier Access Act. The only time that they are allowed to hand carry someone off is if, in the event of an actual emergency and you've got to get off the plane very quickly. So that was just, again, one example. Other barriers include being physically harmed in the boarding or deplaning process. Also in 2019, PVA's newly elected national president was severely injured when he was dropped while being transferred to an aisle chair so that he could board an aircraft. Fractured his tailbone, and as a result of the incident, he developed skin breakdown and a bone infection. And he ended up spending 3 months as an inpatient in the spinal cord injury unit at the VA's medical center in Miami. And as a result, has been pretty apprehensive about when he chooses to fly and when he decides to make those long drives, which unfortunately that's the choice many people make. Other issues, damage to wheelchairs. The Department of Transportation now publishes on a monthly basis the number of wheelchairs and scooters that are emplaned and subsequently damaged. So we have data for 2 full years, 2019 and 2020. The requirement went into effect December 4 of 2018. But for 2019, the airlines emplaned 685,792 wheelchairs and scooters. And of that amount, about 10,500 were mishandled. And mishandled could mean that they were lost, they were delayed in arriving, or they were damaged. In 2020, which of course was impacted by COVID, so the numbers of emplanements are significantly lower. We had airlines emplaning about 268,600 wheelchairs and scooters, and then they mishandled about 3,500 of those. And of course, every one of those mishandlings reflects somebody who may have had their trip ended because their wheelchair was damaged, because it was lost. We've had members who, because the wheelchair was misplaced by the airlines, the person spent 30 minutes on an aisle chair and ended up developing pressure sores as a result of that. So we always want to point out that even though when you look at the percentages of employments to mishandlings, it ranges in the a little over 1%, 1.5 to 1.2%. Every one of those is people potentially being put at danger, having their trip ruined because of this process. And then finally, not receiving appropriate seating accommodations just based on some of the problems that we mentioned earlier. Next slide, please. So what are the reforms that are needed? So passengers with disability related complaints, they can file a complaint directly with the airline. And if you want any type of compensation, typically you'll get miles or something like that. That's where you have to go. You can also file your disability-related complaints with the Department of Transportation. And while the department isn't going to be able to get you any specific compensation, it is important to note that the complaints are how DOT really looks at, are there problems? So I do want to encourage any of you who are, who are people with disabilities and you have problems with air travel to file those complaints. You can file them online. It's fairly easy. And it really does help us to show that there are problems. I know many PVA members, just got tired of filing them because they would get told, yes, it's a valid complaint. And here's where they violated your rights, but then nothing would ever change. But we do want folks to keep filing those complaints because as you'll hear about some of the other efforts we're doing, it really is helpful. Unfortunately, there are things that really aren't addressed, barriers that are not addressed by the air carrier because in fact, they're not illegal. And those, relate to the inaccessibility that you see on an aircraft, from restrooms to path of travel, the airline seat, the ability of somebody to help you get in and out of the seat, from an aisle chair, the use of an aisle chair. And really, it's just because the airlines have not been subject to the design requirements that we see under, the Americans with Disabilities Act that impact trains and buses and subways and all the other forms of mass transportation. And then unlike most other civil rights laws, the Air Carrier Access Act does not have a private right of action, which means that you can't just, go to court and say, well, you violated my Air Carrier Access Act rights. You can do that under the Americans with Disabilities Act, but you cannot under air travel. And that really leads a lot of times a very little redress for grievances. And this is why, we believe that Congress really must do something to amend this law. Next slide, please. So one of the things that PVA has been doing since over 35 years, since we helped file the lawsuit that went to the Supreme Court, but about 6 years ago, we decided that we were hearing so many complaints from people that we really wanted to try to reinvigorate our work. And so we held a kickoff meeting with 6 other disability organizations to really talk about how can we begin to improve the process. And through that working group, we developed proposed legislative language that eventually became the Air Carrier Access Amendments Act, began working more closely with the Department of Transportation, trying to forge relationships with airlines to figure out how we could make changes for passengers. And our working group has continued to grow. We meet on a near monthly basis. We now have over 20 organizations, including the Reeve Foundation, that participate in those efforts. Next slide. One of the first, if you will, victories that we were able to get was in the FAA Reauthorization Act of 2018. So the Reauthorization Act is something that it typically, Congress will typically reauthorize for, 5 years, 4 years, some period of time. And then they have to come back and revisit it. And if they don't either extend the authorization or do a new one, the planes stop flying. So this is one of those pieces of legislation that's kind of the must pass. They have to do something every year. And the reauthorization has been the way in recent years that we've been able to get changes made. For example, in the early 2000s, they made a change so that the law would apply to foreign air carriers, because originally it was only domestic US airlines that it applied to. So back in 2018 was when it was last authorized. The next authorization goes through 2023. So it's not something Congress has to work on this year. I'm sorry, in the 117th Congress, which is the Congress we're in now, that will last for 2 years. But in the 118th, they will. And the groundwork will start being laid, and which is why we're really trying to get more focus on the Air Carrier Access Act, Amendments Act, which I'll talk about in a minute. But for the Reauthorization Act of 2018, we were able to get several disability-related provisions in the law. And quite frankly, we stopped a few bad ones, which sometimes is just as important. And many of those provisions were included in the original version of the Air Carrier Access Amendments Act as it was introduced in the 115th Congress. So this is now the third Congress that it's been introduced now that we're in the 117th. Next slide, please. So some of the key provisions that were in the law, we had a whole section on disability. And I just want to highlight a few that are actually in play going on right now. So one of those was section 432, the study on in-cabin wheelchair restraint system. And the US Access Board and the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine are currently working on a study to determine the feasibility of in-cabin wheelchair restraint systems. In other words, flying in your wheelchair. And if feasible, so if that is possible, then ways in which individuals with disabilities, including those who use power chairs, could be accommodated in the cabin. That study is currently in process. They've had some public meetings, are working on a report that will be due to Congress. It isn't, let's say, advocate types. It's more of the scientific folks on all sides, which is good. And PVA is fortunate. We have two individuals who are PVA members, and they're also scientists. So they are on that group and are able to bring both perspectives. We're hopeful that we can at least answer the question that yes, in-cabin wheelchair restraint is possible, and that from there, it's how do you operationalize it. Another provision in the FAA of 2018 was section 434, which regarded a disability bill of rights. And that requires the Department of Transportation to develop a plain language bill of rights that explains to passengers with disabilities, the airlines, their contractors, all of the rights and responsibilities that each of them have, and would require the airlines to display that on their website, to provide it pre-flight notification to anybody who requests an accommodation ahead of time so that they will know what their rights are, and then also require airlines to train their employees and contractors on its requirements, because many times there's a lot of ignorance about what's included. And then also I wanted to point out section 439, the advisory committee on the air travel needs of passengers with disabilities. So the Secretary of Transportation, starting back in 2019, established an advisory committee. So it's a federal advisory committee to look at issues solely focused on passengers with disabilities. I was appointed to the committee through PDA, and we had our first meeting in March of 2020, right before COVID, which was quite interesting. We continue to meet throughout the rest of the year in subcommittees looking at various regulatory issues, including ticketing, wheelchair stowage, and assistance for passengers with disabilities. We're hopeful that there will be a fall meeting of this larger group, and those meetings, because they are federal advisory committee meetings, are open to the public. So stay tuned for more on that if you'd like to dial in. And the advisory committee is also has done a little bit of work on the Bill of Rights during our March 2020 meeting, and we're hopeful that we will be able to do a little more. Where waiting some for DOT to give us some guidance there, but I know they seem like small steps, but we really have gotten more attention on the issues of passengers with disabilities in recent years than we have for a while. Next slide, please. Now, all of that's not to say that we don't need to do more. So the Air Carrier Access Act Amendments Act, which, as I said, has been introduced now for the third Congress. And in this Congress, it's HR 1696 with Representative Langevin as the lead, Jim Langevin out of Rhode Island. And then S642, Senator Tammy Baldwin out of Wisconsin is our lead in the Senate. And this legislation would really do the fundamental reforms that are needed to change air travel. And that is one, it would strengthen the administrative enforcement that DOT currently does, because right now it's very nominal, very little enforcement, and would also establish that private right of action, which we think would really help to put some teeth into this law. It also would ensure that new airplanes are designed to accommodate the needs of passengers with disabilities by requiring airlines to meet defined accessibility standards, similar to those under the ADA. That would be developed by the Access Board. And then requiring the removal of access barriers on existing planes. So if it's readily achievable, which is again a concept from the ADA, then airlines would be required to make those changes to begin the process. Next slide, please. So some of the proposed physical standards that you might see are safe and effective boarding and deplaning, which I don't know anyone that would argue we have that today. That's sorely needed. Looking at seating accommodations, it's very difficult to help somebody get in and out of those airline seats. Accessible lavatories don't exist on the vast majority of single aisle aircraft, meaning people are flying across country without access to the restroom. No visual announcements for people who may be deaf. Stowage of assistive devices isn't very good, which leads to wheelchairs being damaged. And we think that with better planning, either those wheelchairs could fly in the cabin or at least have more provisions related to the cargo area to facilitate. Next slide, please. So the legislation, as I mentioned, the Senate bill, Senator Baldwin is the lead, and then we have 6 co-sponsors, Senators Casey, Blumenthal, Markey, Merkley, Duckworth, and Hassan, who have signed on. And then on the House side, we have again Representative Langevin, as well as Representative Titus, Cohen, Cleaver, DeSalner, Pingree, Adam Smith, Eshu, Levin, Napolitano, and Pappas, who have signed on to the bill. We've had some House folks sign on in recent weeks. There's been a push to get folks on, but we've got a lot more that we want to get on who were on in the previous Congress. So we continue to need advocacy. So the next slide, really we need you advocating for the Air Carrier Access Amendments Act and laying the groundwork as to why this substantive change needs to take place. Now that can mean contacting your members of Congress via email using the system that the Reeve Foundation has in place that makes it easy to send those emails to your members. You know, if you happen to see them in person at an event, maybe back in the district or state, or if you make a phone call, you know, there are certain points you might want to make, such as, you know, this has been the law for 35 years now, and yet the problems are very difficult. And if you have an air travel story, tell it. Most people with disabilities I know have multiple stories, unfortunately. And it seems as though you know, there's a lot to show that there is a problem here. And then of course, ask the member to support this law. This is as I said, this is a really major push, and the airlines are really, really powerful. And this having this legislation in seeing the groundswell of support from people with disabilities is really going to be important to showing why this fundamental shift in travel is needed. All right, Kim, I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you so much, Heather. We really appreciate that update. And I think now I'm going to send it on to my colleague, Chris.
Yeah, thank you, Heather. That was amazing. And for some of the folks who are joining in with us, you might recognize a lot of what Heather was talking about by one of our more recent action alerts that we sent out. So I'll jump ahead a bit here on our updates on the action alerts to go right to our ACAA action alert that we put out recently, because we really got some good traction with it, considering that it was only targeted to members of the House of Representatives. We had 834 people send 864 emails to their members. And on top of that, it was an action alert that garnered 386 new advocates, which is a pretty significant amount for such a targeted alert, at least based on ones that we've done in the past here at the Reeve Foundation. So I think that might speak to, you know, a real growing sense of interest that people have in this particular issue. And to go in a little bit more detail on it, you know, we had the highest density of emails went to Representative Jared Golden, who's in Maine's 2nd congressional district. And the second highest density of emails was sent to Rep. Thomas Massey, a Republican from Kentucky's 4th congressional district, who sits on the Transportation Committee. So I think that we've started to create some traction here, some momentum amongst our advocates around this issue, and hoping we can take that into meetings that we'll try to organize with some of these members during the August recess, which I'll get into here briefly. And if I can back up a bit to the other action alert that you will all probably recognize from earlier this month or late last month was our appropriations action alert. This was Again, even more targeted than our air carriers access action alert, where we focus specifically on members of the Appropriations Committee. And we were able to send 77 emails to 34 members of the Appropriations Committee to get support for funding the Paralysis Resource Center. A lot of those emails went to Representative Catherine Clark of Massachusetts 5th Congressional District. And I know that we have some regional champions who live in Representative Clark's district. If you do, we would really love for you to take that next step come August and reach out to her office and really try to set up a good working relationship with her office. She's the 4th leading Democrat in the House. She's on the Appropriations Committee, so really a key member of the majority party in the House of Representatives. So going forward, as Celicia mentioned, they've passed the appropriations, HHS appropriations bill through the committee. We're waiting to see when it will come to the House floor. And when that happens, be on the lookout for a new action alert in regards to Paralysis Resource Center funding when that bill finally goes to the full House. And then, of course, when it passes that hurdle and moves on to the Senate, we will have another one coming up. But looking forward to next month, when we expect Congress to take a break and leave Washington, D.C. and head back to their home districts for the annual August recess. This is a really great time for us to reach out to members and to set up meetings in their home districts and talk to them about our main priorities, which of course are Paralysis Resource Center funding for fiscal year 2022, and then building support for HR 1696 and S642, everything that Heather just went over. So our to-do list for next month is going to be, reach out to your member to schedule a meeting if you can. And as always, if you need help finding contact information for your member's office, please reach out to me. I know some of you have already, but we always expect some staff turnover in these offices, especially in a new year. So if you want an update on your contact, please let me know and I will get that for you. And I will also equip you with our 2021 advocacy toolkit, which will include more information on the Air Carriers Access Amendment Act, reiterating a lot of what Heather just went over. And of course, we're recording this webinar and we'll send it to everybody when the event is finished. And I would definitely urge you all to maybe take another pass and listen to Heather's presentation again, because it was so rich with detail and some really great pointers for how to talk to your members about this specific issue. This also includes more information on Paralysis Resource Center funding, which you can bring into the office. We'll have a copy of the Langevin Dear Colleague letter that went out, I believe in May, which we also had an action alert around that issue. Please review that letter. Just take a look at the members who have signed on. If your member was one of the individuals who signed on, to that Dear Colleague letter, something that you can bring up in the meeting. You can thank them for that support and just remind them that this is an issue that they've taken up and they've added their name to. And we'll also give you a list of the quality of life grantees for your home state. And I will highlight, who in your specific congressional district has been awarded a quality of life grant from the Reeve Foundation, because that's always wonderful information to bring into the offices. These offices love to hear about the investment being made in their home district and to see specifically, how that investment is helping. So you can study and review all of that information, but most importantly, remember that you and your experience and your story is the key ingredient to all of this. So just be prepared to share your story with those members, how action on these two priorities will be impactful for your life and the lives of your families. And of course, if you need any assistance in formulating your ideas, or if you want to go over anything ahead of a meeting with the congressional office, please reach out to me. I'm here to help you in any way that I can. And before I sign off, I just would like to thank everyone for your efforts thus far. I know some of you have already had some meetings. Some of you have already taken action, sending emails and letters around PRC funding, around Air Carriers Access Amendment Act. Thank you so much, and I hope that we can keep that momentum moving forward into the summer. So we will take some time now for questions. If anybody on the call has any questions, you want to add it to the chat. Myself and my colleagues here will do our best to field any inquiry that you might have.
Chris, this is Kim. I'm not seeing any questions just yet, and we'll wait. We'll give participants a minute if they'd like to put one in the chat. But while we wait, I just wanted to just highlight, this year, and again, special thanks to Heather for really, really illuminating this very, very complicated but important issue. And next week, we'll be celebrating the 31st anniversary of the ADA. And, many people who may not understand all the provisions that were included in that erroneously think that air travel is covered under that. So this is why it's very, very important that we try to garner as much support as we can for improving this law.
So Joanne Meyer asked, how to get an advocacy toolkit. Joanne, I'm gonna send you my email right now, and you can reach out to me. And for the rest of the participants on the call, I'll put my email in the chat box just so you all can have it. And if you have any questions or you need any of these materials or the recording of the webinar here, please reach out and I will get back to you as soon as possible.
Looks like we have a couple other questions. I'll start backwards, and I think this question is for Heather. We have a participant asking about this person joined late, and I can't. What are the results? When are the results of the cabin study due? And if you know.
So this is Heather. It's either this fall or the next fall. That was what was required under the law, because I think it was 2 years after it went into effect. So they may already be 1 year past. So it should be soon, but I don't have a date on that.
Thank you, Heather. And as soon as, of course, we receive word that that has been done, we'll be sure to send it to all of our advocates. And we have an additional question around how individuals can become involved with PVA and supporting this piece of legislation. So there's a couple ways you can do that. Chris will, as he mentioned, send information around how you can work on this August recess with the Christopher and Dana Reeve Foundation. Of course, we'll be happy to send Heather's contact information as well. There's some really great information they have on their website, of course, as they're leading the efforts and helping all of our organizations stay informed and organized as we try to garner support for this bill. So look out for the follow-up email, and we'll be sure to include Heather's contact information as well. Looks like we have an additional comment from a participant. I've asked to stow my manual wheelchair in the cabin closet several times. I have been told that it's only required if there's room after first class passengers were given the option to use the closet space. Is this correct? Heather, I'm not sure if you know the answer to that. I do not know the answer to that.
Sure. This is Heather. So under the regulations, it says that airlines must ensure that those individuals, if you're eligible to pre-board and you take advantage of that, that you can stow your wheelchair on board, and that has priority over items that are brought on by crew or other passengers that are enplaning at the same airport. So that would mean that if you and first class passengers are all getting on at the same time, first class passengers do not have priority over the stowage. The stowage priority goes to the wheelchair user. And that is actually in the regulation. So I would say that if you encounter that again, I don't know if you've asked to speak with a complaint resolution officer, but each airline is required anytime they are doing business, meaning they're flying, they have to have someone who's there either in person or by phone, who's called the complaint resolution officer, or CRO for short. And they're sort of like the passenger advocate who's supposed to be highly trained in the rules and can educate the crew members who are not always as highly trained on these requirements. So I would suggest that you do that, or reach out to the airline you're flying next ahead of time and ask about that issue. You can also contact the Department of Transportation. They have a hotline. Unfortunately, it only works Monday through Friday, 9 to 5 Eastern, but they can provide some real-time assistance as well.
Thank you. We have an additional question around a follow-up to the media, to the study results, and if we planned on doing a media strategy regarding the results. And I don't know if, Heather, we've talked about that as a coalition yet or not, but.
No, that's a good question. It's something we haven't talked about yet, but something that I would imagine that we would, particularly if the results are favorable, which we think that they will be, that we would want to highlight both in the media, on the Hill, because the next step would be then if there's no safety reasons why it can't be done, then it's a business, how do we implement it? And that's getting over the hurdle that is the airline. So yes, we would definitely need to be able to highlight that report and the results. So stay tuned for that.
Great, thank you. And John, I'm going to ask you, we also have an attendee just asking for some clarification, and I know you reviewed it in your slides around HCBS in the infrastructure proposals. Would you mind just reviewing that quickly again?
Sure, absolutely. So it's a great question. As folks know, the HCBS funding, $400 billion, was included in President Biden's proposed infrastructure plan, the American Jobs Plan. We don't have clear detail on both whether and how much of that funding has been included in the budget reconciliation legislation and the budget resolution that sort of is the precursor legislation to that. But it's definitely expected that legislation, which is the big infrastructure package likely to pass with only Democratic support, will include HCBS funding. We've heard rumors that the number has potentially come down from that $400 billion level. And actually this week, the Reeve Foundation, along with a number of other organizations, signed a letter to Congress encouraging them to include that entire $400 billion figure for HCBS. So we expect that it will be in there. The details of that larger proposal are still being worked out. While we've been on the call, I read an article that said the deadline for when they will sort of put out that proposal is likely to slip into early August. So stay tuned, but we're keeping a close eye on where the HCBS funding is.
Great, thank you very much. I think we've answered all questions unless I'm missing anything from our panelists before we.
Yeah, Kim, this is Chris. And Heather, just going back to the question about the cabin closet and first class passengers. I know you mentioned in your presentation about registering complaints with the Department of Transportation. Is this an example of an issue that it would be productive in regards to Air Carriers Access Amendment Act to bring to the Department of Transportation?
Yes, so if you have tried to use your chair, have your chair in the cabin and then you were denied access to that, I would definitely recommend that you file a complaint with the department. Anytime that there is a violation or you think there's a violation of the law, because like I said, that's how they really look at, okay, are there problems? They look at the number of complaints. And although there's about 30,000 some odd complaints, 35,000 usually filed directly with the airlines, the ones filed with the department actually are under 1,000. So anything that we can use to show where there's training that needs to be done, there's problems. DOT is required to investigate every single disability related complaint in air travel, and they do. So that's a bit different than the ADA. So definitely recommend filing that complaint.
Thank you.
Great. It looks like we've answered all of our questions. This is an issue we'll continue to revisit. We will take on other issues around travel and subsequent webinars around trains and other ways that people get around. We really wanted to focus on air travel and hope that you will focus on this when you're communicating with your members of Congress this August recess. So again, I want to thank all of our panelists, especially to Heather, and we look forward to working with you over the summer. And stay safe, everyone. Thank you.